What are your thoughts about taking notes in therapy? Let's have a talk about it. Hello, this is James from Therapy Business School. I hope you're doing well wherever you are in the world. Now, whether you're a student or whether you're qualified, and whatever your teaching modality is or what you've been trained to do, what are your thoughts about taking notes in therapy? Is it a big yes? Is it a big no? Is it somewhere in between? Well, here's my own thoughts. I think it's a good idea, but I'm going to caveat this as we get into it. I think it's a good idea because if you're working with a certain timeline, for instance, it's a good idea for you to pull a bit of paper out and say to the client, okay, who are the names of these? Imagine the client is a play and there's different characters in that play. Well, you want to make sure you're keeping track of who's who. So it's a good idea if you have a pen and paper handy. If you're working with timeline therapy or you're just trying to get an idea of who's who the characters are, to be able to draw them out. So the way of doing this, you can put the client's name in the middle of the page and you can then put a circle around that and draw lines off it. And at the end of a line, there's another name. And that could be the person's name and what their relationship is to the client. So I've got John, the client, and I've got Jane is the sister, and Jeff is the father, and Susan is the mother, this kind of stuff. It makes it really clear. So it also takes the heat off you to not only be remembering and processing what the client's saying about what they're presenting with, but who the characters are as well. And I found clients really don't mind this at all. So if you're referring to your notes and you're saying, so when you were talking about your brother John, you were saying that, you see how it works? So that's a really good way of how you can use notes in therapy. Now, you might also make notes of things that might occur to you in the therapy session. Now, you can either bank this mentally or you can write it down. So let's say the client touches on a subject and you might think, I want to go back to that, but the client's in mid-flow. You can make a note of it. So I recommend you can do that as well. What I would say is, before you do take any notes in a session, if you decide to do this, ask the client if they're okay with it. Get their permission and explain to them these notes are also confidential. So only me and you see them unless there's a court order. Now the clients can also request copies of your notes. So that's another thing to be mindful of. Under the Data Protection Act, the client can say, well, yeah, can you send me the copies of the notes that you made? So you got to be careful what you put in them, because what you put, what your thoughts are, you own, but what the client has said, they own. If that makes sense. So let's pick a scenario. Let's say the client is talking about, the in relationship. The relationship is having problems. They're arguing a lot. There's threats. They're not communicating very well. Intimacy is an issue. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. Well, you could be thinking, okay, what's the client's family background? What's their dynamic when they were growing up? What was their home life like? What was that in their partner's life? Is the client able to inform you on that? Is there conflict in the client's upbringing that's causing an occurrence in their present everyday life? Well, these are your thoughts. But if a client says to you, oh, when I grew up, my father was an alcoholic and used to beat my mum up. Well, now they've told you something. So if you put a DV or domestic violence note, then that's something that they've told you. So they're entitled to if they request it. Now, something else to consider. If a case goes to court, you can be asked to provide your notes of the therapy sessions. Now, what I would recommend here is, if this happens, take it to supervision and be guided by what your supervisor or your agency, if you're working for an agency, what they recommend in that kind of situation. It's not necessarily, if you're working for someone else, it's not necessarily a decision you will make. It'll be a conversation you'll have with your supervisor or your agency manager and say, this is the situation, what would you recommend? we do about this, and you'll be guided by that. And I don't really want to go too much into that because every situation is different. All right, so this is not a crystal clear, you must do this. This is a recommendation. All right, so note taking with your clients, I would encourage you, make sure if you do take notes, you have to retain them as well. All right, and that's so in case they're ever needed again in the future. As I think about that, one other good point is that if you do take notes, you have to store them, and you have to store them securely in a locked cabinet or something of that ilk that no one else has access to. If it's a Word document and you have it stored on a hard drive, it has to be encrypted. There has to be security measures in place so no one else can see the client notes. Now, what some theoretical schools recommend is that you don't make extensive notes. It's not War and Peace. It might be just the salient points. So that's something to discuss with either your agency or your supervisor, or I'm going to say agency, I mean your agency manager, and get some guidance regarding that as well. If you're brand new to this, they will be advising you. I'd like to think you're writing too much. You don't need to write so much detail, but you do need to cover the salient points because they're your notes. And if you were required to go to court, it'd be you giving evidence on, these are my notes. And did the client mention this? Did the client mention that? Why is that not in your notes? What's going on? This kind of stuff. But I don't want that to frighten you. It's just a procedural thing. It really is. In my former career, I was a police officer, so I was in court thousands of times as a police officer, not as the defendant. And you get asked all these kind of questions. So did this happen? Is that in your notes? Did that happen? Why isn't that in your notes? This kind of thing, okay? So don't be too concerned about it. They just want to check if this happens. And it's so rare. I mean, it really is so rare. But you just want to be prepared that if that were to happen, you know what you're doing regarding it. And it might be, you see a client now, and it's 6 months, maybe even a few years later, you're being asked for your therapy notes, all right? So it's good to get the correct procedure in place early doors, I'd recommend. So I hope this longer than normal video has helped. This is James from Therapy Business School. I hope you're doing well. Bye-bye.